Good evening, everybody. If everyone can take their seats, we'll start with this evening's program. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, the president here at the Center for Jewish History. Welcome to tonight's event. I know we're streaming live as well, so welcome to everybody who's joining us on Zoom. For those of you who are here for the first time, the Center for Jewish History is home to the largest archive of Jewish historical sources outside of the State of Israel. The center is comprised of 5 major partner institutions: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Together, their holdings comprise more than 7 linear miles worth of archival material dating back to the Middle Ages, including the largest Holocaust archive outside of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The center, however, is more than just an archive devoted to preserving the Jewish past. We also seek here at the center to mobilize historical knowledge to address the challenges of the present through our public programming. And tonight's event is notable because it's the kickoff event for our brand new program series, Anne Frank in History and Memory, which we've created in support of Anne Frank, the exhibition, and which is sponsored by and presented with Ancestry, the Jewish Book Council, the United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program, and Yeshiva University Museum. As you'll see when you look at our upcoming calendar of events, Anne Frank in History and Memory features a range of diverse lectures and film screenings, all of which essentially pick up the story of Anne Frank where the exhibition ends. And I hope some of you have had a chance to see the exhibition, and if not, I'm sure you will see it in the coming weeks. What I mean by that is, put simply, the series moves beyond the question, who was Anne Frank, to the question, who is Anne Frank today? And to help answer this question, which has long been surrounded by debate and controversy, we're very fortunate to have with us Ruth Franklin and Jonathan Rosen, who together will be discussing Ruth's brand new book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. To formally introduce Ruth and Jonathan, I'd like to welcome up to the podium Rebecca Keyes, the Managing Director of Jewish Lives.
Good evening. My name is Rebecca Keyes, and I'm the Managing Director of Jewish Lives for the Leon D. Black Foundation. We work in partnership with Yale University Press to publish Jewish Lives, a prize-winning series of biographies featuring Jews who changed the world. Now, with over 70 titles published to date, the series includes biographies ranging from Moses to Freud, Spinoza to Golda Meir, Betty Friedan to Mel Brooks, and of course, many more. You can learn about our books at jewishlives.org. Our latest biography in this series, The Many Lives of Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin, was published only just yesterday. It's an exceptional work. In the words of author Dara Horn, it sets the standard for anyone thinking about Anne Frank for years to come. It goes without saying that Anne Frank is one of the most recognizable Jewish figures in the world. And it seems obvious that she would be included in a series like Jewish Lives. And yet, as a biographical subject, Anne Frank stands apart. She is the only child in the Jewish Lives series. What does it mean to write a biography of a child, a life cut short? How do we honor her memory? I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for hosting tonight's discussion and the Jewish Book Council for their ongoing partnership. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers who will help us explore Anne's life and legacy. Ruth Franklin is the author of the new Jewish Lives biography, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Her first book was A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. She is also the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. Franklin's work appears in many publications, including The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and more. Jonathan Rosen is the author most recently of The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions, which was named a top 10 book of the year by the New York Times and was chosen by Barack Obama as one of his favorite books of 2023. The Best Minds was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and other publications. He is a consulting editor at the Free Press. Jonathan and Ruth, I hand off the discussion to you. Thank you.
I'm going to go first. Just first of all, to say how wonderful it is to be here with Ruth, whose book is terrific. I found it enormously moving, which I didn't assume I necessarily would, partly, I think, for the very reasons that you write about in the book. I had kind of come to think of Anne almost like an Andy Warhol series of cold prints and not this incredibly vital person. I also had not read the diary since before I had children. I have 2 daughters. Reading it after October 7th gave it another intensity and immediacy that did not only feel like they'd been imposed in my reading, and I'd love to be able to ask you about that too. But you do so many things so well, and one of the things you do so well is frame these paradoxes, not just about Anne Frank, but about what it means to be a Jew, what the Holocaust means or meant. And for me, I grew up with these paradoxes, not just in a general way, but in a specific way. My mother is literally in your book. And I remember when the annotated Anne Frank came out, and my mother and Cynthia Ozick were both writing about it and talking about it. And the sense of restoring to the life the death, which was enormously important in their minds. And so I kind of passed through all of these stages. And so to read your representation of them now was wonderful, and I hope we get to explore some of those paradoxes. One of the things you made me feel, though, is that they're more resolved in her, Anne Frank herself, than I would have imagined, some of them. So, and then the final thing I'll just say, although I'll probably say a lot of things that you do so wonderfully well, is when you speak about rescuing Anne from all of those other images and hijackings and kidnappings that have denatured her. And that was, I think, what I found so moving about the book. So I guess I just kind of want to ask you initially, what made you choose to write about her?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for those words of praise. And thank you to Gabrielle and everyone at the Center for Jewish History for having us here. It's such an honor and privilege to be able to speak about my book here tonight. So thank you. Why Anne? Well, yes, as you say, why write a biography of somebody who seems to have already told the world all about herself in this remarkable document that we've all read, probably more than once, starting at a young age, and that is such an indelible part, not just of Jewish literature, but of world literature. But as you say, and the closer, the more we read the diary, it seems, and the more omnipresent she is in our culture, the more she turns into an icon, and the more difficult it becomes for us to see who she was as a person. And as a biographer, that's always the aspect that I'm most focused on, the individual, how we get inside another person's head. And so for Anne, of course, the process was very different than for my last subject, Shirley Jackson, who left behind a plethora of archival material and many people who knew her to interview. Of course, with Anne, all she really left is the diary. And I started going back to it and looking at it in all of its versions. What's called version A, the original version that Anne first wrote, and then version B, which is the edit that she did when she went back to the beginning and rewrote the diary from the start as a public document of testimony, rather than a private document of her, unburdenings or her feelings and her, her thoughts about puberty and all the stuff we know it as. And it was important to me to see both of those versions and to try to construct a different image of Anne from the publicly available version, looking at, both her thoughts in their original form, in their roughest form, in the form that maybe she didn't want to publish, and then to look at the way that she constructed her own vision of herself, her own persona, as a writer of Holocaust testimony.
So that makes great sense. I guess I want to ask more about that, but you write a wonderful newsletter, and I was admiring. I've read it for a while. I was admiring your ability to communicate directly with your readers and explain it right in an almost journalistic way. And then suddenly I was reading it, and I felt like I was Kitty, in the sense that I was the recipient of your journal, and I'm curious if the journal itself and all the questions it raised for you has entered your own work. There's also a quote at the bottom of your page from Shirley Jackson that could just as easily speak to the some of the conversation about Anne's diary, which is, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are considered by some to dream. From The Haunting of Hill House. Did you ever associate those things?
My goodness. Well, I would love to hear more about how the connection you have drawn between The Haunting of Hill House and Frank's diary, which is a place that even in my imagination I had not quite gone. But I appreciate what you're saying about my newsletter, which I've seen. I have a newsletter on Substack that I would be very happy if any of you felt like subscribing to. I call it Ghost Stories because it started off as a newsletter about Shirley Jackson, who was a great writer of ghost stories, and it turned into a newsletter about writing biography, which I see as its own kind of ghost story. And the biographer as haunted by different kinds of ghosts, or almost a sort of a ghost chaser. And I felt very much haunted by both of my subjects, in the sense that that they were always present somewhere in my mind, into the forefront, to the back. But I hadn't quite considered that. You're right. Over the past few years, as I've been working on this book, I have chronicled it in letters to an audience, if not an imaginary kind of figure. And I did that because it feels useful to me to work out those ideas on the page. I'm not always thinking of an audience, although it is, also useful to see how things land with an audience and get feedback, and to see how people react to the ideas that I'm putting out there. But because I see book writing and perhaps biography especially as, very much about the journey as much as about the finished product. And the book itself, I think, tries to incorporate some of that journey, in that there are places where I sort of engage with the conversation around Anne and around the diary, where I openly sort of ask questions to Anne herself or to other critics who I'm in conversation with throughout the book, other readers, historians. And so I saw the process of working on this book as sort of an ongoing conversation with, readers who are real and readers who are in my imagination.
I think I was also thinking, I read The Haunting of Hill House because you told me to, and it was incredibly scary, and I don't like reading scary things. But the challenge of horror, the challenge of writing about the Holocaust is the opposite of horror, because horror is like an imaginary creation of all of the darkest fears. But Anne really was a girl who millions of people wanted to kill. They wanted to kill all the people who were hiding with her for a very specific reason. And so there could be no fantasy or paranoia in that direction that would not have been justified and that wasn't ultimately fulfilled. And so it's sort of, actual horror would have almost made no sense in a strange way.
Right. In fact, it's not there. It's not there at all. Although she does appear in some later fiction, she appears as a ghost in a couple of the novels about Anne Frank that I've read. There is, of course, a whole genre of books in which Anne appears in some way or other, sometimes as an actual character, sometimes just as a symbol or a figment of somebody's imagination. So, and there are a couple in which she appears as a ghost herself.
Right.
But yeah, she doesn't need horror writing. I mean, I think people look to ghost stories to kind of work out their fears, but her fears could never be made into a metaphor.
Well, what's strange is the quote is about the need for imagination. You can't stand too much reality. But the whole fight about her legacy, and maybe you would talk a little about it because I'm so interested in it, is about wanting to spare people, in a sense, an aspect of the horror of her actual story, or not wanting to impose certain things on what they hoped would be a larger audience, perhaps. And I'm curious how you think about that.
That's really interesting. I mean, one complaint that's been made about the diary over the years, and Cynthia Ozick maybe is made it most famously, was that it doesn't admit a lot of the reality of the Holocaust by virtue of ending as it does before Anne is deported and taken to Westerbork and then to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, where she dies. And so there has been this criticism made that part of the reason the diary has been as tremendously successful as it has been, the reason that it's seen as so relatable by all sorts of people all around the world whose circumstances are, as very far removed from Anne, is because it doesn't require its reader to face the most terrible reality of what happened to the Jews during World War II.
But also, if it doesn't, then it allows people to fill up her story with their own, with their own afflictions or sufferings or historical feeling of injustice. And
well, that's very true, and I explore a little bit in the book the way people from Philip Roth to many other people throughout the decades have used Anne as sort of a mirror to reflect their own preoccupations. For Philip Roth and the ghostwriter, he's using the character that he creates for her as a way of exploring his own anxieties about what it meant to be an American Jewish writer. In some in a way that's comparable to the way that she thought about what it meant to be a Jew in the Netherlands under Nazi persecution. There's a moment in the diary where she says, we can never be just Dutch people or Germans or French or whatever. We will always also be Jews. And then she goes on to say, but we want to also. We're proud of that identity. I think we can see so much of Philip Roth's work, especially in The Ghostwriter, where he presents his alter ego as a young writer, very much working through this question of, can he just be an American writer, or is he always going to be an American Jewish writer with the hyphen? We see so much of it as working through that problem, and he uses that actual passage from Anne as a way of talking about it.
Yeah, so I want to ask you something else about that, but I want to just go back for a second, because one of the things I really feel reading the book that you do so well is weave in all of the people it took, not just for Anne to make this book in the first place, but to survive the war. So she has her family, she has all the people who worked with her father, she has the people who keep the secret, the people who got her food. And so in that, these are all the good forms of collaboration. But also in terms of actually creating the diary, at one point you refer to Otto, her father, as her collaborator. And when you yourself talk about how you want to write next to her, not over her, which I think is a beautiful way of putting it, I'm wondering if you've come to think of writing, the older I get, the more collaborative writing seems of any kind, how much like a collaboration that her diary feels, aside from the question of whether she was an artist or not, but just that it was a kind of a work of collaboration, and that you were also, in a way, collaborating with her in this.
That's a really interesting way to put it. So I chose to call the book The Many Lives of Anne Frank because I wanted it to be really a panoramic view of her. In the diary, as beautifully written as it is, as beautifully expressive, we see through her point of view. We see her life as she saw it. And I wanted to bring in the other perspectives. As you say, all these people, not just her parents, but all these people who sustained them in hiding, who played an enormously important role. And that's one of the many ways in which the Franks were exceptions. It's often said that part of the reason, and it's almost a shame that Anne's story has become a sort of defining of the Holocaust experience as it has, is because she was exceptional in so many ways. And one of those exceptions was that she was in hiding with her family. Only 25% of Dutch Jews went into hiding. The Netherlands had the highest rate of Jewish death during the Holocaust in Western Europe. 75% of Jews in the Netherlands died, and the vast majority of them were simply rounded up and deported to first to Westerbork and then on from there to different death camps without really having any chance of surviving. And then about 25% of the Jews went into hiding, most of them not in as fortunate a situation as Anne, who had the benefit of, she was in hiding in this building that had housed her father's workplace. He had control of the building. His employees worked there and were able to bring them food. His employees were non-Jewish, and so they had connections. They had connections with the resistance and were able to get things like ration cards and supply them with food, whereas most Jews who were in hiding were in a much weaker position, and in fact in a very dangerous position where they were quite dependent on the goodwill of whoever happened to be taking care of them. And you can read many, many stories of children who were usually separated from their parents in hiding. That's another way in which she was unusual. And especially girls were often subject to sexual abuse by their hiders. So long story short, there are many, many people who went into sustaining the Franks in hiding as long as they were there. And then, part of what I wanted to fill in terms of, as I spoke before about how, of course, the diary ends before these last 7 to 9 months of her life that she spends in concentration camps. And I really wanted to fill in what happened to her during that period. And there's a lot of testimony that's been gathered by researchers. There's a documentary film about the last months of her life that's made mainly from testimony of other Dutch women who were in the camps together with her and knew her there. And I also read a lot of testimonies of women in the camps who may not have known her, but who were in prison in Auschwitz or in Bergen-Belsen at around the same time, and trying to extrapolate from their experiences what may have happened to her as well. So I felt an enormous responsibility to try to tell that part of the story, not through imagination. There's no point in which I, make up anything that I don't know that actually happened to her, but just sort of trying to use informed speculation to fill in the gaps of what she doesn't tell us herself.
I noticed that you tell her death early in the book, which I thought was enormously effective, so that you then encounter her later entering of the annex. Do you call it the attic or the annex?
I call it the annex. I don't call it the secret annex, as it's usually called in English, because that's actually, I found out researching this book that it's actually a mistranslation of the Dutch, or a more poetic translation. So in the book, I just call it the annex.
Right. But I'm wondering if you did that intentionally so that the diary is then read through the awareness of what is to come, or if it was one of the tellings and then you tell it again more fully, very movingly again towards the end.
Yeah, I did do that intentionally, not because I thought that there might be any reader of this book who didn't actually know what had happened to Anne. Although I do tell one story in it of an incredible man who encounters her story as an Eritrean refugee in an Ethiopian refugee camp. And he perhaps must have been one of the only readers in the world who came to Anne Frank's diary without knowing who she was. And he describes reading the diary and being devastated by the ending. He didn't know that she wasn't going to survive. And then he has this amazing project where he translates the diary into his native tribal Eritrean language. And he's an example of one of the many figures I encountered during the research on this book. I started collecting stories of people who had been influenced by her in unusual ways, creative ways, and writing little profiles about them. And, I wasn't sure how I wanted to incorporate these into the book. The structure of it didn't come to me until much later on. And I wound up just sort of sprinkling them through. The first half of the book deals with her biography in a more or less conventional way. And then the second half, which I call Anne Frank in quotation marks, is about the idea of Anne Frank, and is really a cultural history of the idea of her as it's changed over the years since the diary was first published. And so I feature a few of these stories just as examples of the ways in which her work has penetrated, in truly unexpected and often very moving ways. But yeah, to come back to your question, I did decide that I wanted to narrate her death early on, sort of because I wanted to get it out of the way. But also because I didn't, the luxury of writing a book about somebody whose life story is so well known is that you don't have to stick to a chronological format. And yet, biography is often best told in chronological order. That's how we live our lives. But through telling the book, as I do through these different facets of Anne's identity, which I call in the title The Many Lives, but really they're conceptions of her identity as different people saw her. So, she's a child in the eyes of her parents, and she's a target in the eyes of the Nazis, and then she's an artist in the eyes of herself when she's creating the diary and revising it into a testimonial work. And so that structure, I settled on that structure because it felt very flexible and sort of able to expand to allow us to explore different episodes in her life that related to those conceptions of how I saw her.
One of the things I thought was so brilliant and moving about the story, in the story you tell about the Eritrean man who then goes to Ethiopia, that's where he first reads the diary, and then he winds up in a camp in Sudan, I think, and then he winds up in Egypt, and then he decides to go to Israel. And these things come about. His ultimate destination is directed by the diary. And what I thought that was bound up with in an unexpected way is that he asks when he crosses the border and he's picked up by Israeli soldiers if they know Anne Frank's, because he's looking for her family. And that's his idea. Meanwhile, he had been trying to translate the book and keeping scraps of notes, which were then all confiscated. And the soldier, sort of laughs and he says, "I know who she is from her diary," but he gives him food and water, and he stays there for 8 years, and he gets an education there. And although in some sense you might say the point is, well, he ultimately can't stay or doesn't stay, and that's a contested issue, it is the one place where he is in fact gathered in by an aspect of the civilization he recognized in the diary, when the Franks, like the Swiss Family Robinson, are living in a higher, their civilization is better than than the betrayed Dutch and the Nazis who are trying to kill them. German culture has fallen, whether or not Otto's aunt is named after Goethe's sister. And so there's this wonderful moment, and it's an element in the revision that I'd love to hear you talk about, where Anne has written in her diary, in her list of rules, because a new person is coming, only civilized languages may be spoken, so no German. And Otto fixes it, but for the publication, doesn't he?
In German.
In German.
But in English, in Dutch, in English, and the other languages, that's still there, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a fascinating detail. The Franks, of course, were German. They came from Frankfurt. Otto's family had lived in Frankfurt for hundreds, or in the surrounding area for hundreds of years. They saw themselves as deeply German, and there are these wonderful stories about how, sort of, I guess, painful in retrospect about how deeply invested in German culture these Jews were. There's a story about one of Otto's uncles reading Faust underneath his prayer book at synagogue. Apparently Jewish boys were given sets of Goethe as a bar mitzvah gift. And of course, it went so far as Otto was an officer in the German army during World War I. And of course, we all know that their country rejected them. They weren't quite as German as they thought they were. And they came to the Netherlands, and Anne was only 4 when they came, 3, almost 4 when they came. And of course, picked up Dutch. We think of her as a Dutch girl. She wrote her diary in Dutch, even though she was, born in Germany. Her sister, Margot, as well. They both really assimilated into the language. And Otto did as well, because he went to work every day with Dutch people. But for Edith, Anne's mother, it was much harder. And her friends were mainly among the other German refugees in the area of Amsterdam, where they had settled. They had this very rich and warm community of German Jewish refugees that they socialized with a lot. But it was hard for her to speak Dutch all the time. And I think for Otto as well, it was his 3rd or 4th language at that point. He already spoke English well. And also for the Van Pelses, the other family whom they were hiding with, they also were German Jews. And it's really something to think about how they kept up. They did not speak German in the annex because it was not a civilized language. Even though Otto taught Anne the classics of German literature, they read German, but they didn't use it as the language of their daily life.
Right. It made me think somehow, and was a surprise for me until I read the book, that Anne is already different from the culture that has produced her in her father, who's busy tutoring everybody, and he seemed like such a warmer and more wonderful person, actually, in the sense that he was, constantly giving them lessons and really creating an environment inside of that annex. But when another fix he makes is, she writes, I wrote it down, Germans and Jews are the greatest enemies in the world. And he wrote, these Germans and Jews, and he wrote something else. What did he write?
These Germans and Jews are the greatest enemies. And so this happened when the diary was translated into German, which happened within a few years of its publication in Dutch, right even before the English edition. And Otto, in collaboration with the German translator, came up with these little fixes, as you call them, for the German audience, who would have been, we don't know, but Otto expected that they would be insulted by these references to German as an enemy language, and to Germans and Jews as enemies. And I think Otto writes somewhere that he also was thinking about the many German friends that he still had. I mean, they left behind in Frankfurt neighbors whom they were close to, friends that they maintained after the war, and he pictured these people's feelings getting hurt. Which is a moment of great empathy on his part. And part of my own journey in writing this book, you talked a little bit about what it's like to read the diary as an adult and as a parent who has children around this age, which also was my experience. And the result for me, and perhaps for you as well, Jonathan, is just deep, deep sympathy with Otto, who is the only survivor of the 8 people who were in the annex, who survives Auschwitz, makes his way back to Amsterdam. He knows that Edith has died in Auschwitz, but he thinks that Anne and Margot might still be alive. And there's about a month or so where he waits in Amsterdam for news of them before learning that they've died from somebody who was in Bergen-Belsen at the same time. And when he learns that, Méprise, his former secretary, who was one of the heroes who sustained the family in hiding, brings him Anne's diary, which she and another of the helpers have found on the floor of the annex. It's Anne's original little red checkered diary, and also all the papers that she used to revise it and work on the published version that we know now. And she says to him, "Here is your daughter Anne's legacy to you." And I found it so moving. And there's a little scene in the book in which I imagine what might have been going through Otto's mind when he sits down to read the diary, having lost his daughter. You just have to have the greatest sympathy for him, and also so much admiration that, having experienced all that, he took this text and did what he did with it.
Probably because, like you, I had a renewed identification with Otto. I mean, I was only reading the diary through your book because you wonderfully weave in passages. I wonder if you ever felt, as I did, that wouldn't it have been, I wonder if he ever thought, in addition to teaching French grammar and German, he had smuggled in some small arms. I'm not actually joking, because he was still, they knew, Anne at one point knows that there are no longer Jews in the open. They're all gone. They're all gone because they've all been rounded up. And she knows that although there are Nazis there are also Dutch Nazis who did a lot of that rounding up, and Jew catchers, as they were called. We can talk about Amsterdam, maybe, I hope, if there's time to, in its reborn form. But what I meant is that I wonder if he was still relying on Anne understood that she was a hybrid now, not quite Dutch, we're never going to be any of these things. We're going to, and she's very specific about it being Jewish. She even says, maybe after the war is over, if we survive, it'll be Jews and our religion that teaches other people how to appreciate life.
A light unto the nations.
Yes, but I'm wondering if you also thought maybe he could have broadened his understanding of, like we all talk, it's so much, you write so well about the embodied nature of Anne Frank. It's literally her, they all were hiding, like in the wainscoting, like the borrowers. Could they have done something else?
Well, that is really interesting, and we only know his mind during those years through what she writes about it in the diary. So, I want to say, as far as I know, he didn't think about that. He didn't think about armed resistance. But of course, we don't know if he thought about that or not. We only know what he told her. They had friends in the resistance who were armed and did resist in that way. There were other Jews in Westerbork who at one point were planning a rebellion and a Jewish takeover of that camp that was thwarted actually right before the Franks arrived there. So there are these moments. I think I have to say it's hard to picture how they would have done that. But
I think for me, it speaks to another paradox of her story. People always say that the victors write the story. Yeah. She's not a victor. She's a moral victor, but she's killed. The Jews of Europe lost the war. And yet, here her diary seems to have emerged triumphantly from the ashes. And I wonder if it makes the conditions of her resurrection part of the confusion it allows a kind of confusion bound up with all the Christological elements that you write about as well, that can both honor her and simultaneously divorce her story from the history around her.
I think that's right. And, she has, I think, almost this sort of mythological or fairy tale ambience around her, that she becomes almost like a fairy tale. I sort of work against this image of her as a fairy tale princess in a castle who's just waiting to be rescued, which I think, denies her the very positive agency that she took, again, in seizing control of her own narrative in the way that it was possible for her and telling her story to the world. But, the mythological story that it really does resonate for me in that respect is the story of Philomela, which I talk about a little bit in the book. The nightingale, the woman in Greek mythology who's raped by, I believe, her brother-in-law. And so that she won't tell about it, he cuts out her tongue. And then to get revenge on him, she weaves the story into a tapestry. And I see Anne Frank's story, her resonance in a similar way, that, the Nazis tried to silence her. They deported her, they threw her papers on the floor of the annex in the assumption that she wouldn't be able to tell her story, that she would be silenced. And yet, she rose up in this almost miraculous way to bring to life those words again. And I think that's something that, that readers can sense in her diary, even if they don't know the specific, circumstances around its creation and publication.
But I think that myth works wonderfully well, but I'm also just haunted by this story you tell, which there was a bill in 1939, Senator Wagner and Congresswoman got together and they wanted a bill that would allow 20,000 German Jewish children to come to the United States. And you quote someone who actually was related to the commissioner of immigration, who basically said these 20,000 darling children will grow up to be ugly adults. And they got to have, her words triumphed, but in a weird way, she met the conditions of that woman's grotesque ideas about Jews. In other words, she's like Peter Pan. She never grew up. She's a permanent child, and you don't have to think about what grown-up Jews, in that you do if you understand the diary and the world. But I guess I'm just curious if how much when you think about her as an emblematic or an unrepresentative person. I think she's actually enormously representative, but I'm just curious if her kind of being frozen in that way also is a falsification.
I mean, there are these stories about, neo-Nazis or other anti-Semites reading the diary and saying things like, oh, well, they should have spared her. And of course, we know that that's not the way anti-Semitism works, or, racism or bigotry in any of its forms, in its most radical and devastating, manifestations. It takes everyone, right? And from the babies to the elderly and everyone in between, they're all considered enemies. And, I think we saw that on October 7th. And we see it elsewhere too. And, the immigration story, I think, is exceptionally painful because, we see that Otto Frank at one point was trying to get visas for the family to come to the United States. In fact, I did research on that part of that story here in this building. The files are here and at YIVO, and it's called the Otto Frank file. And you can go to the library here and read these very, very sad letters that he wrote, and the responses from the American refugee committees and other people who were trying to help him and couldn't because of the quotas on immigration in 1941 and 1942 when he was trying to do this. It's 1941 before America enters the war. Because the laws were constantly changing and nobody knew exactly how to do this. There was a real catch-22 that it seemed like perhaps it was made deliberately impossible for Jews to fulfill all the conditions to get these visas. And we see him struggling. And, I'll say that in the last year and a half or so, as we've seen the rise in anti-Semitism and, some of the frightening situations that we've seen in this country and elsewhere, I've often thought of Otto Frank and his, unfortunately belated decision to try to get his family out of the Netherlands. And it makes you really have to think about, how do you know when it's too late?
Along those lines, there's this, you remember the terrible incident in Amsterdam not long ago when it was called the Jew hunt, and there were all of these people chasing Israeli families, children as well. It wasn't as it was subsequently described as, soccer ruffians who provoked people. Their very existence was the provocation. But there's something that the king of Denmark, of the Netherlands said, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm wondering, I also printed out half your book because I only had it on as a document, and I thought, well, I'll just bring my iPad. You don't all need to know this, but I'm just trying to explain. It says Dutch King Willem-Alexander told Israeli President Isaac Herzog, "We failed the Jewish community of the Netherlands during World War II, and last night we failed again." And I think maybe connected to that is a lot of the debates that go on about the diary are Jews worrying about how to represent Anne and Jewishness. I mean, the producers or the scriptwriters, they're not all Jews, but many of them are. So some of them say, let's swap out the Hanukkah song because Mao's Tzor is a downer, even though actually it's about how in every generation they've come to kill us. It's a perfect encapsulation of their situation, and they were moved by that. But I'm wondering about how you experience things like this statement and how much it seems like it's easy for people to claim her in an almost exonerating or exculpatory way, or I would have hidden her. But I wonder, this is really about neutrality. What the king is saying is about the failure of the Dutch was that they thought they could remain neutral in a world in which that was simply impossible. Doesn't mean they would have been overrun, but it is interesting that they thought that they could and then regretted it afterwards, I believe. And so I'm curious how much, if there's as much discussion in that world, maybe beyond the diary.
Well, I think it's important that the King of the Netherlands is acknowledging the failure of the Dutch people during World War II, because, for so long that was really kept under wraps. And there was a sense, first there was a sense, of course, the emphasis was on the enormous suffering that the Dutch non-Jewish population experienced under the Nazi occupation. They starved during the last winter of the war. They experienced extreme privations. And when the Jews came back, those, the small percentage of Dutch Jews who survived, their Dutch neighbors weren't always so sympathetic to hear what had happened to them because of the ways in which the Dutch had also suffered. And so I think, and that's a particularly sad part of the story, I think, in the way that these two groups weren't really able to speak to each other and understand each other after the war. And for many years, the extent of Dutch collaboration really was, brushed under the rug and not discussed in Dutch society. And that started to change somewhat in the 60s with the publication of an important book by a historian named Jacques Presser, about the Holocaust in the Netherlands. It's a book that I draw on a bit in my book and discuss the extraordinary story of Presser, this historian who also was a teacher at the Jewish Lyceum, which was the high school that Jewish students were forced to go to after the Nazis forbade them to attend regular schools. They were, shunted into this high school that had to spring up spontaneously and that happened to draw wonderful teachers from all over the Netherlands, Jewish teachers who were no longer allowed to teach in other schools and who created a special community for these Jewish students during the time that they were there. And after the war, Presser wrote this extraordinary book looking back on the years of the Nazi occupation, which he lived through and witnessed, and also he lost his wife, who died in Sobibor, which some of his students remember seeing him in the classroom after learning that his wife had been deported, which is just an incredibly moving scene. And Presser was able to look back and synthesize his own memories of these years alongside the history that he presents in his book in an extraordinary way that was in some ways a model for me in writing this book, in which I also try to synthesize, some of my personal journey, some of what it was like to research and write this book and engage in all of these, swirling questions around Anne and around the diary, while also, trying to find my way through that thicket to my own perception of her. But I think, especially in the last few decades, there has been much greater effort among Dutch historians, both Jews and non-Jews, to really confront what took place during those years and acknowledge the role of the ordinary Dutch in the destruction of the country's Jewish community. Are we moving on?
I think, do you want to now ask audience questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting conversation. I wanted to ask, as someone who read your book carefully, Ruth, 2 questions that I got partly from the book. Why do you think the Japanese responded so strongly to the book? Because I think you say at some point either 5 or 7 million copies sold there. And I wondered what was the particular link. That was question 1. And the other question I had more to do with the portrait of Otto Frank, which is, I agree with both of you, who is very moving, but some of the changes he made were not solely out of the wish not to insult people, fellow Germans. Wouldn't you say some of the changes were made to protect the portrait of himself? I mean, he took out certain things. So I was just curious about those 2 things.
Okay, so 2 totally unrelated questions. I'll discuss the Japanese first. It was a source really of great fascination to me that Anne Frank is so popular in Japan, and I had the great fortune of being invited to go to the University of Tokyo to give a talk about Shirley Jackson, of all subjects, while I was researching this book. And I met a fascinating woman who runs a Japanese Center for Holocaust Study and had the opportunity to talk to her about her work. I think in the years after the war, the superficial answer is that especially Japanese youth, responded to Anne's diary just the way that, people everywhere else in the world did. Apparently, also, they saw her as a sort of Judy Blume type figure, or, a Judy Blume character, in that her diary was apparently one of the first books in Japanese to talk about menstruation. And so there is a linkage between Anne's name and the concept of girls getting their period to this day. There's a tampon named after Anne Frank in Japan. So that's one way in which she's lingered in Japanese culture. But in a more complex way, of course, the Japanese had their own, very kind of dual experience during the war of being at once, allied with Nazi Germany and part of the Axis powers, and also suffering the devastation of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think, and Anne's diary arriving in that country as it did, in 1952, just in the wake of that devastation, I think did allow Japanese people to have maybe an easier identification with the victims in World War II than they might have otherwise, in a way that, as we were just talking about the Dutch, allowed that society also not to confront the ways in which it was implicated in the Holocaust and its allyship with Germany until much, much later. Of course, not only that, but the war atrocities that Japanese were guilty of elsewhere in Asia also is a subject that's still extremely controversial in Japan today, and taboo in many circles. Okay, so moving on to Otto Frank and the stuff that he took out of the diary. So I think he made, and for the most part, the changes that he made to the diary were small. They were line edit type of changes. He did take out some of Anne's harsher criticism of her mother, some of her harsher criticism of the other residents. And I think, when we look back on this, we have to remember that, if Anne had survived the war, she had gone through the camps with these people, the women, of course. She was in Auschwitz together with her mother and Margot, and from people who knew her there. We know Anne from the diary as being very, feisty and talking back to her mother and feeling a lot of confrontation with her the way teenage girls do. The people who knew her in Auschwitz don't talk about that part of their relationship. They say that Anne and Margot and Edith were, they stuck together. They had relationships with other families. There were other mothers with sisters in the camp who they formed kind of a team with. This is actually, something that I did a lot of research into, specifically the situations of women at Auschwitz while I was researching this book, who suffered in that camp a little bit differently from the way men did. And I think, our view of the concentration camp prisoner has, really been narrated from a male perspective. We know the stories of Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, and what happened to women in the camps was a little bit different. And one of the ways in which it was different was that they tended to stick together in these families and surrogate families that sprang up, that they looked out for each other. And there's one really lovely metaphor that I quote in the book from a woman who says that they were like stitches in a piece of cloth, and they were looking out for each other so that no one would be the dropped stitch. And that's how they were in the camp. And later, Edith was left behind in Auschwitz, and Margot and Anne, together with Mrs. Van Pels, were transferred to Bergen-Belsen. And somebody, when we think about Anne and her relationship with Mrs. Van Pels, if you remember things from the book, she just can't stand her. She's so insulting. She has almost nothing nice to say about this woman. There was somebody who knew them in Bergen-Belsen who thought that Mrs. Van Pels was Anne and Margot's mother. That was how close they were to her at that camp and how they all took care of each other. And so I think when we look at it from that perspective, it's not at all unreasonable that Otto dampened some of Anne's criticisms of these people who she might well have felt quite a bit differently about after the experience that they had all gone through together. Now, I just want to say also that the largest change that Otto made, which is almost never discussed, is that Anne removed her romance with Peter from her version of the diary. She took out all of those entries, and now she only finished her revision up through a certain point, so we don't know what she would have done with the rest of it. But there's a point during the winter and spring of 1944 where she's writing about her crush, her feelings for Peter, pretty much every day. And she took all of those entries, she took all of that part out of her published version of the diary. Again, why? Because I think she wanted it to be a work of public testimony. It wasn't supposed to be about her teenage romance. It was supposed to be about the persecution of the Jews. And Otto put all of this back in, knowing that that wasn't what she wanted. And there's a point in the book where I also pause and I ask myself, wait a minute, why am I talking about all this stuff when I too know that that's not what Anne wanted? And, we can only speculate about why Otto put all this stuff in, but my sense is that if he hadn't, the diary would not have become the phenomenon that it did, because it's the romance in part that makes it so relatable, right? That's part of what makes her feel so much like just any other teenage girl who has a crush on a boy, right? And I think Otto had a sense of what a great story that romance makes it.
Thank you, Ruth and Jonathan, for being here tonight, and thanks to the Center for Jewish History for this brilliant discussion of Anne Frank. So I have comments for each of you, which I'll save to an appropriate occasion. My question for you, Ruth, I'm wondering how you might relate to, or think Anne Frank might relate to, another young woman of resistance and resilience, a contemporary global icon, now 22 years old. I'm speaking, of course, of Greta Thunberg. And by the way, there has currently been an attempt to silence her. The current parlance would be to cancel her, since she's become so vehemently anti-capitalist and anti-Zionist. So would you be able to put that together, how you might think about Greta Thunberg in relationship to Anne, and how Anne might think of another young woman in relationship to her resistance and her resilience? Thank you.
Well, I think one thing that's useful for us to remember is that Anne wasn't particularly political. At a time when, there might have been other Dutch teenagers in hiding who would have asked their helpers to bring them, documents from the resistance, underground newspapers, political pamphlets. Anne was asking for movie magazines and novels. She almost never commented on politics. There are a few entries at the end of her diary where she writes about feminism. That is really one of the only issues that she's outspoken about. She's a bit, negative about her mother and Mrs. Van Pels, who are kind of ordinary. She sees them as ordinary housewives. She wants to grow up and be something more than that. Her sister, Margot, her ambition is to become a midwife in Palestine, which was something that many Zionist girls dreamed of being at that time. And Anne thought this was incredibly boring and wanted to have, a glamorous life in Paris and I think London, where, she learns about art history and wears beautiful clothes. And, again, we can't speculate as to how Anne would have felt about any of these things had she survived the camps, right? Because we just can't know. But I think it is telling that in a social arena where she had friends, she had many friends who were interested in the Zionist movement, who went to Zionist youth groups, as so many European youth did at that time. She was not interested. So I honestly don't know that she would have had much in common with Greta Thunberg or any other young, activists.
I'm just going to add my 2 cents. I think that Greta Thunberg is a great example of what hung over the anxiety about the diary when people like Otto wanted it to be what he called universal, not recognizing, understandably, that the less Jewish it became, the more parochial it became, and the more particularly Jewish it was, the more universal it actually would have been, but in terms of its actual story. And I think that I was going to actually ask you about this, Ruth, because you've written wonderfully about Elie Wiesel, and Elie Wiesel wrote his own multiple versions of his own book, and one of them was a very angry, much longer book in Yiddish. One of them is a book in French. One of them was written after his encounter with the Catholic writer Francois Mauriac, who had won the Nobel Prize, was 70 years old, and said to Wiesel, who was in his 20s, he was talking to him about the crucifixion and his admiration for the other Israeli, as he said to Wiesel, Jesus. And Wiesel loses it and says, 10 years ago, it's 1955, and not far from here, they were in Paris, 6 Jewish children were crucified, and their suffering is 6 million times more than the suffering you're talking about, and we don't tell their stories. And the idea, actually it then turns into a whole interesting thing that I won't talk about, but I think the thing about Anne Frank's story is that it lends itself to something Christological. An instance of Jewish suffering, stripped of its historical context, becomes separated by making it unusual, and the Jews are then the very people who experienced the pain and the suffering connected to the martyrdom of the one chosen person are then blamed for it. So it's even more perverse than merely appropriating a story. It's appropriating a story for which you are then punished. And that's precisely what the Nazis were continually doing. It's what motivated the very attack in which she is in sympathy with. It was just the existence of people like Anne who were taking up space in a place they didn't think they ought to be that justified the killing of them. And so I think that you talk about a piece that Nicholas Kristof wrote about how Anne Frank would be a Syrian refugee, and how in a way you can't. I actually think the diary, when you read it, makes it quite clear why that is not the case. It is completely anchored in its own experience, but people are free to lift and manipulate and distort, even if we can disapprove of it.
Yeah, thank you. It's very enlightening talk. I read your piece in the Times, Ruth, about the particularistic essence of her story rather than universal, which I accept that. I can understand that, but it is a very, very strange moment. We're sitting in here tonight with what's going on right now in this country. So there has to be, like, it's an elephant in the room, the situation where Musk is there saying the AFT, is good and we should downplay the memory. I mean, Germany, it's amazing that they were able to reconfigure their society because there was the memory and the history taught. So I think what you just said, Jonathan, I understand that, but I think we have a moral duty to see the resonance here of what people are obliged to do faced with some of the similar situation that was going on. And God knows, let's hope, but we don't know what will be.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And, I think what I tried to say in that piece isn't just that, Anne Frank's story has to be a Jewish story, but it's that it has to be both a Jewish story and a story that can be extrapolated from to a broader frame of reference. And that the problem is that, these things often are seen to cancel each other out. Either it's a story for the world or it's a story for the Jews, and they can't both exist side by side. And what I was trying to say in that piece was, they must. And that's this particular gift that Anne's diary gives to the world. And, that Otto saw that from the beginning, where he said, it's a Jewish story, but it's not only a Jewish story. It has to be a story for everyone, and it has to retain its character as a Jewish story. And, I think in the sense that, there are a couple of ways in which people have tried to, have said that the story needs to be updated for the present day. And one of these, is the column I mentioned in the book that Anne Frank today would be a Syrian girl. And in fact, the writer of that column is referring to the Otto Frank's struggle to get a visa and the difficulties facing refugees who are trying to escape from, today it's from the Middle East, who are being denied entry into Western Europe, into the United States, just as Jews were persona non grata during the years, preceding the Holocaust. And I think, yes, it is absolutely incumbent upon us to see those parallels and not to make the mistakes that were made in the past. And at the same time, we have to understand that, when we say that Anne Frank's story needs to be updated in order to retain its relevance, we're suggesting that anti-Semitism is kind of a done deal, right? It's a solved problem that we don't need to worry about anymore. And, what I'm trying to say is that both of these things need to coexist.
Hi. So in your writing, you mention two quotes. One being Anne saying everyone that she believes is truly good at heart. And later that's followed by, I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. In a lot of writings and a lot of plays, shows, I've seen them cut out that last part. Do you think that takes away from her story? And how do you think that impacts the broader narrative of who Anne Frank is?
Can you repeat what it was? I had trouble hearing it. I'm the only one.
Yeah. So the question is about the most famous quote from Anne Frank's diary, which is where she says, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart, which is often referenced, as a sign of her positivity, her belief in humanity, her great optimism, and it's often used as kind of a cudgel by people to beat her over the head and say, look how naive. This is the naive cry of a child who didn't know what she was talking about. And there are a number of, Holocaust researchers and other people who say, that this is the Anne before the camps, and an Anne who had survived the camps would no longer have believed that people are really good at heart. And first of all, I hope has been clear tonight, I don't believe that we can speculate about what an fictional Anne who had survived the camps would have believed or would not have believed. I don't think that that's responsible. But secondly, people quote this phrase, as you point out, without quoting what Anne said after it, which is she says that I still believe that people are really good at heart, but I feel a sense of darkness. I hear the approaching thunder, and it's coming for us too. And yet I still hope that, that in the end that we will come through this. I'm not quoting because I personally am terrible with quotes.
That's why I printed out your book.
Yeah. But in the end, I have faith that we will come through and the world will be right again. And this actually was a change in my own mindset towards this, often maligned quote as I was researching the book. And, part of the reason it's become so famous is because it was the last line of the original Broadway play adaptation of the diary. Many people believe that it's actually the last line of the diary, which it's not. But, it is, I hadn't really thought about it in a more complex way. And then one of the stories that I write about in the book is the story of these anti-apartheid activists in South Africa in the 60s who are in prison on Robben Island, isolated from the mainland and often in solitary confinement. And somehow they get a copy of Anne Frank's diary and they pass it around the prison until the pages are falling apart. And some of them actually write out quotes from the diary in their own notebooks. And one of them was this quote. And the activist, Kathrada, he writes the whole quote with "people are really good at heart," and also, I feel the thunder and it's coming for us too. And it struck me reading that for somebody like this, who is, a democracy activist who is trying to build, who is in prison for trying to build a new society, who still has the dream that they will be able to do that someday, that the belief that people are really good at heart is actually a very radical thing to believe in, and a truly, remarkable statement, a political statement of political optimism, and that somebody who is fighting to rebuild their country really has to believe that. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to continue.
I'm just going to chime in for last thing to say is that I think you're totally right. Reading your book, I just kept thinking how Jewish she is. And I know that's silly because you'd think she would be, but partly it's because I had grown up thinking of that line, that people are basically good, as if it were an erasure of her own experience, instead of the fact, as you say, these evil people are coming for me. People are basically good, so they've chosen to do evil. And in a sense, she also writes later in the diary, after saying, Peter hasn't looked at me since yesterday, there's in people simply an urge to destroy, an urge to kill, to murder and rage, which is like what God says after the flood. But she goes on to say, I want to be useful or give pleasure to the people around me yet who don't really know me. I want to go on living after my death. And put that together with the statement when she says, we can never become just Netherlanders or just English or any nation for that matter. We will always remain Jews, but we want to, too. What she says is, when I will bear this suffering, she says before that point, and if there are still Jews left when it is over, when Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example, who knows? It might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And what's amazing to me is all of these are biblical principles. And so she is simply affirming, it's extraordinary to me the degree to which she is embodying Jewish wisdom in all of its forms. To say people are basically good does not, free them of the obligations of the consequences of their actions. And so in a way, she's the most sophisticated person in the room. And that's, Jews worship the universal God. That is the universalism of her Jewish particularity. And that is why, rooted in her own experience and the high degree of civilization she's absorbed from this remarkable family and the mysterious generations, she is articulating something that can be used to change the world for good, but that doesn't in any way disguise the evil that is done to her and that was done to Jews on October 7th. On the contrary, it links them not by saying, oh, this is like that because they're both bad, but because these principles are enduring. Reading your book, I really just thought she's extraordinary in that regard as well.